Hey guys, that's the first tutorial for Soldiers vs Zombie game. In this video we're gonna set up the project, the tile map, and install some enemies using scriptable objects. Let's go through it. That's an empty project with one scene and the main camera. Let's start and create our grid and tile maps. We will have 3 layers of tile maps. The first one will be the ground with the ordering layer equals to 0, roads with ordering layer equals to 1, and the details tile map with ordering layer equals to 2, where I'm gonna add some details like rocks and trees. Okay, so I got some sprites from the Canyon website, and don't worry to download those sprites because I'm going to create a different branch for each video. So all sprites that I'm going to show here will be there. Now let's import the tile set to draw our tile maps. I'm gonna store them into the sprites folder. And before using them, let me set the compression to none so you won't lose quality on those tile sets. Let's create a new palette and store it into the palette folder. This will be a new folder. Let's drag our tile sets into the tile map tab and save it also in the palette folder. Now we have a new palette. Let's draw our ground, part of them with sand and a bit less than the half with grass. And we have also this tile where it creates a beautiful division between the grass and sand. Now we have our ground. Let's select our roads tile map and draw 3 roads. There is a specific tile for the road on the grass. Let's draw a division for each road and then pick the tile that goes on the sand side. Let's add some details like those brown trees, green trees, rocks, some woods. They won't make any difference in the game. Those are here just to make the scene more beautiful. So now we have our grid. Let's add one enemy coming from this place and going to the left. Let's import the zombies to our sprites folder. Same as we did before. Zombies. Let me select all of them and set the compression for none. Apply. Now let's create a new empty component and call it enemy. Add a sprite renderer into it. Set the ordering layer to 4 because you want the enemy to be above of the ground. And also check the flip of the X position because the enemy should look to the left side of the screen as it will go from the right to left. I'll create a folder called enemies and we'll put all scripts related to it inside that folder. And first file will be the enemy script. Let me create a rigid body here so we can use it to move the enemy. Going back to our script, I will create a private rigid body 2D and call this rig. The awake, I want to get the rigid body equals to get component rigid body 2D. Cool, now I have the rigid body. And then let's change the velocity in the fix update, setting a new vector 2 minus 1 as x and 0 as y because we don't want to change the y, we want to change the x from right to left. We also need to set up a speed for this, so let's create a float speed times speed and also times time fixed delta time. Now if I go back to our code, we have our enemy. Let me add this enemy script here and say 10. Just test and see how it goes. So yeah, you see it's going from right to left, but you see it's very slow. So let's add a speed factor constant int speed factor to 10 and do speed times speed factor and go back and run. It's better. I don't have to have like big numbers to represent the speed. Like we don't want to create enemies manually. What we want is to have like a spawner for this. And also we want enemies with different velocities, also enemies with different sprites. So let's create a scriptable object. Let's call this scriptable object as enemy stats. In this enemy stats, I want the speed, also the sprite and other things like life, coins, how many coins the player will gain killing the enemy, this kind of thing. But for now, let's create a scriptable object where file name used by newly created instance of this type and I want them to have the enemy underscore as a prefix. And the display name is the type shown in the assets create menu in Unity. They like scriptable objects, enemy. So there's public float speed. And also I want to set the sprite because I want different sprites to show. So now we have the enemy stats. Let's create an enemy spawner. What I want for enemy spawner is like, I'm going to create an object here and I'm gonna say how many enemies and which enemy is going to spawn from each spawner. So in this example here, I will have 1 spawner, 2 spawner, and 3 spawners. Going to enemy spawner. First, I want to serialize field, a list of enemy stats, and also the enemy prefab. Let's create a function to spawn an enemy. I'm gonna call it spawn. Let's instantiate a new enemy passing the enemy prefab and the transform position. Now you have a new instance of an enemy, but each one has its own sprite and speed stored into the enemy stats. Let's pick one of the enemy stats from that list. As I don't want to spawn the same enemy every time, I'm gonna pick a random one from the enemy stats list. Let's use the random range method to return a random number from 0 and the length of the list, and then return the enemy stats in that position. Now we have a random enemy stats. Let's set the enemy speed. We don't have access to speed from here, so let's change the access modifier of it to internal in the enemy script. Okay, now going back to the enemy spawner, it's possible to access the speed attribute and set it with the enemy stats value. Now let's set up the sprite. Going to the enemy script, let's create a property called sprite and update the sprite handler inside the set. So when the sprite property has been changed, we also want to change the sprite handler of this component. So now if I go here, enemy sprite equals to enemy stats.sprite. So let's go back to Unity. I'm going to change this from an object to a prefab. So let's create a prefab folder. Drag the enemy into this prefab folder and delete the enemy in the scene as we don't need this anymore. Now it's time to create our enemy spawner and then attach the enemy spawner script into it. As you can see, we have 2 properties on it. First, the enemy stats that will be empty for now because we didn't create, and also the enemy prefab. This we just created, so let me set it here. Now it's time to create enemies, and this means create scriptable objects with different data, because we are gonna have zombies with gun, with machine, and also with a silence. Besides, they will move towards the same position, they will have different speeds and power of attack. So let's create a scriptable object for each one, set the correct sprite for them, and set a random number for their speed. First, the zombie with a gun. Let's set speed to 5 and set the correct sprite. Let's duplicate the zombie with a gun, change the sprite to zombie with machine, and set speed to 4 and rename it. And the third one, the zombie with a silence with speed 6. Cool, now we have 3 different types of enemy, like just the data, and this data will be used in the prefab, like all of them. Drag and drop here. Now our enemy spawner component is set up with a list of enemy stats and the enemy prefab. Let's go to the enemy spawner script. We have the spawn method. It's not being called by anyone, so I'm going to create a start method here and call the spawn just for test. I'm going to get rid of this in the future, but just for test, let's call this from the spawn and see if everything is okay. We have one enemy with a machine. So if I stop and run it again, now we have enemy with a silencer. Cool. Let's create a singleton script to control the board. I want to restrict the instantiation of this class to one single instance, as we will have only one board to play. I'm gonna call it level manager. To create a singleton unit is very simple. We can create a public static variable with the type of the class and set it to this on awake. Let's create a list of ints to control the number of enemies that should be spawned in a level. Each index of this list corresponds to a level. The level manager will be responsible for starting the levels. So let's create the start level method and a variable called round to store the number of the current round, and it will be incremented on start level method. Let's pick the number of rounds in the waves list using the round as an index and store it in a local variable. The level manager should also be aware of the spawners. Let's create a field for it. And under the start level method, iterate through spawners and call the spawn enemies function, passing the spawner and the number of enemies that should be spawned. So we can call the spawn method from the spawner enemy script. It will also be good to start spawn enemies with a random delay, so the enemies won't appear at the same time. For this, let's create a field called range time between enemies, where the vector x is the minimum delay time and y is the maximum delay time. So we can call the random range method, passing the x and y values from the field and store the result in the delay local variable. Then use wait for seconds, passing the delay time. Great, now we have the delay and it's also calling the spawn method. But as it can have more than one enemy to be spawned, we need to change this and use the number of enemies parameter to know how many times we should call the spawn method. We can do this in many ways, but I think a good approach would be using do while structure. Do while the number of enemies is greater than 0, we should keep spawning. Once the number of enemies is 0, means all enemies have been spawned. We should call the spawn enemies function for every spawner, and as it is a enumerator, it should be called by the start coroutine, passing the enemy spawner object and also the number of enemies. Going back to Unity, let's attach the level manager into the manager component and create two waves, one with 2 enemies and the second one with 3 enemies. The level manager is also expecting a list of spawner. So let's create a prefab of the spawner. Let's move this to the beginning of the road and add it into the list of the level manager. Now let's test. So it should spawn 1 after some time. Second one. If I stop this, change this to 3 and start, we spawn 1, 2 and 3. It works and it spawned 3 enemies. Let me pause here for a second, and if we see the sprite renders of each enemy, they have different sprites. So that's a zombie with a gun, and the second one is a zombie with a machine, and the third one is another one with a machine. That's great. How can we do this in waves, and how will know that another round started? We need to add something here, so when all enemies reach this place, another round will start and the enemies should be destroyed. Let's create an empty object and call it as end of line, and add a box collider covering the left side of the board, and also check is trigger option. We need to create a script that will check if something is colliding with this end of line. So I'm going to create another script. I'll create another folder called util and create a end of line detector. This will be a very simple script. Let's create a handle for onTriggerEnter and check if the collider's tag is enemy. In case of true, we should call enemy reached the end line and pass the enemy component of the collider. So we have to do two things. One is create the enemy tag and set in the enemy prefab, and second, create a method in the level manager. So first, let's get back to Unity, open the enemy prefab and create the enemy tag and set the tag enemy to the enemy prefab. We should also create a collider for it. Let's add a capsule collider and adjust its size based on the enemy sprite. And we cannot forget to set a trigger option. You see, we still have the 0. We have to create this enemy reach end line. So first thing we need to do is we want to remove this enemy. The enemy reached the end line, so the enemy doesn't need to exist. Let's create this remove enemy. I'm going to destroy enemy.gameObject. Cool, now we removed the enemy. Create another property called, name this to total of enemies. Okay, so every time we call this call enemies, we are going to increase this number. So here we know the number of enemies, so I'm gonna set this total of enemies equals to number of enemies, and then every time I remove an enemy, I will decrease this number, and here I'm gonna check if total of enemies less or equals to 0, start level. Cool, so this will start level, and here we need to check if the current round is greater than the number of waves, it should stop the game and show the game over scene. As we don't have the game over scene for now, let's just add some logs and we can see then in the console. Let's get back to Unity and make sure that those changes worked. What should happen here? So we have only one enemy spawner, and this enemy spawner has 3 different enemy stats. And then if you go to our manager, it should create 2 waves, one with 3, another one with 2. Should wait until it goes through the whole scene and reach this. Let's see. Okay, so you start level 0. Okay, reached and didn't remove. Why? Oh, now I got why it's not working. Because I forgot to add our script, our end of line detector, into the end of line object. So I'm going to add here. Now we have the end of line detector. And another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the enemy spawner. So we have one, another one. Change this place to here and this one to here. Let me change another thing here, like we have the manager, and manager will have only one spawner. We should have also added this spawner and also the spawner number 2. And if I run, I should see they coming, 2 for each lane. And when they reach the final of the lane, they will die, like they will be destroyed, and another wave will come, 1 for each road, and game over. We see this bunch of game over in the console. So let's go to our code and fix this problem. First, let's create a private who is game over equals to false, and then set this to true when the round is greater than the waves count. And we shouldn't restart a level if is game over is true. We'll just return here. Okay. And another thing we need to fix is we are setting the total of enemies equals number of enemies. But what we want to do is we want to update the total of enemies every time we spawn an enemy. So adding here total of enemies plus equals to number of enemies. Now should be fine. Let's go back to Unity and test our changes. We have 3 lanes and we have 2 enemies for each lane. So when all of them reach the end of the line, another round should start. Okay, all reached, another round. You could see here, start level 1. When all of them reach end of line, should see game over, and just one game over. Cool. Now it worked as expected. Let's wrap up this video here. I will like the link of the branch with the code and assets that I used in this tutorial in the description below. In the next video, we will start spawning allies and make the enemies take damage. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and see you in the next video. Thank you and bye!